Hello and welcome to our YSA Autumn Colloquium 2020, Broadening the Perspective, Rare Diseases during COVID-19. We are Maria and Michael, and together with our YSA associates and the Medical University of Vienna, we are very happy to host this Autumn Colloquium today. We, the YSA, the Young Scientists Association of the Medical University of Vienna, are a group of PhD students supporting the progress of young scientists in research, fostering national and international collaborations, and open-minded, vivid discussions and events.
Exactly. Of course, for us as a scientist association, it was not easy, or it is not easy that, let's say, normal seminars and events with persons being in the room are not possible anymore. So for example, also our two-day PhD symposium, which was supposed to be held in June, of course also had to be cancelled due to Corona. But we thought of a new format, and we think we are now ready to tackle scientific exchange that is fit for the future. And this colloquium today will be our kick-off meeting for a brand new webinar series.
Today, however, is very special for us because eminent speakers from the fields of epidemiology, basic research, and mathematical statistics kindly followed our invitations to speak here and discuss this important matter with us and with you. So we kindly invite you to send us questions, and these questions you can send during the talks to our email, which is ysa@meduniwien.ac.at.
Rare diseases pose a major challenge, of course, to individuals and also to healthcare systems. At the same time, however, the COVID-19 pandemic also calls for fast socio-economic measures regarding our public health. Now, just to give you a bit of an understanding, what is a rare disease? Because it sounds like hardly anyone is affected. Actually, it's not the case. So in Austria alone, rare diseases affect around 400,000 individuals, or spoken in the words of EURORDIS, which is the European Organization for Rare Diseases, rare diseases are rare, but rare disease patients are numerous.
Focusing research on one specific novel virus with a global impact, whilst assuring good care and progress for patients with chronic and rare disorders is crucial. Therefore, multidisciplinary collaborations are necessary to navigate through such a crisis. Is the pandemic affecting research of rare diseases and care of patients with chronic and rare diseases? How are specialists, epidemiologists, and statisticians contributing to a fast and recent decision-making to preserve good care of individuals and of public health? We are now very much looking forward to exciting talks and discussions, Maria.
Exactly, so this brings me already to the introduction of our first speaker, who is Eva Schernhammer. She is head of the Department of Epidemiology at the Medical University of Vienna. She studied medicine and psychology in Vienna, and after that conducted several years of clinical work in Vienna with a focus on oncology. She then went to the States in the late 90s, where she received a master's degree and a doctorate in public health from the Harvard H.D. Chan School of Public Health, and she's a faculty member of the Harvard Medical School and School of Public Health since 2003. She's also an associate professor at the UCLA. She received her habilitation in public health and social medicine from the Medical University of Vienna in 2005, and since 2015 she is head of the Department of Epidemiology at the Medical University. She's also an associate faculty member of the Complexity Science Hub Vienna since 2017. And I'm very sure that she's a very familiar face to all of us, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic. We have seen her on webinars and also on TV talking about epidemiologic aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic. So welcome, Eva Schernhammer. We are very much looking forward to the first talk.
Well, thank you, Maria and Michael, for having me and for the YSA to host such an incredible webinar. And I am glad, and it's my honor to kick it off by providing some epidemiological background regarding COVID-19 that will hopefully bridge to the subsequent speakers that follow me today. I want to start off with something lighthearted before we get into the more serious details. 2020 did indeed seem as if it was written by Stephen King and directed by Quentin Tarantino thus far. And it has brought about some peculiarities, like you see on the right side, ways to deal with a mask if you're a smoker. But what is COVID-19? We all know now that this is a disease that is triggered by SARS-CoV-2. It's colloquially referred to as coronavirus, as many of us have heard, and it belongs to the RNA virus family, which can infect both animals and humans. And in humans, the coronaviruses lead to airway diseases ranging from modest symptoms to really severe ones like pneumonia. The origin and course of COVID-19 is not fully established, but what we currently think is most likely the origin leads us back to a wet market in the metropolis or in the vicinity of Wuhan in the province Hubei in China. These wet markets, just to show you how they would look like, are enclosed environments typically and allow for very intense contact between humans and animals. And so what is currently thought is that the bats are the host animal for this SARS-CoV-2 virus, which through an intermediate host, the pangolins, as you see them here, has been transmitted to humans. And bats are an important source. They have been sources for viruses before because they have a very special feature. Bats can sustain very high temperatures, and any virus that lives on them basically gets used to high temperatures, which is bad news for humans because we humans tend to fight off viruses by getting a high fever. And if the fever doesn't help against the virus like those that tend to come from bats, then we have a problem. So in January 2020, we started seeing an epidemic in China. And the first cases came out of Wuhan, where because we are so connected nowadays, getting to all sorts within China and surrounding countries. And then on January 24th, something very important happened. The Chinese New Year was celebrated in 2020 on that day. And you have to imagine this an event like Thanksgiving in the United States, where the most travel happens in China. So that has probably accelerated the spread of the virus across China and subsequently also elsewhere. On February 2nd, WHO declared an official name for this epidemic. It was called COVID-19, Coronavirus Disease 2019. The name of the pathogen was also changed. We remember back initially it was called 2019N, new coronavirus, and it was now changed to SARS-CoV-2. From Wuhan, the virus traveled to Europe and the United States. And we all remember these pictures here from Italy, our neighboring country, where doctors in February began to be overwhelmed in the healthcare system because they were exposed to the virus and it quickly deteriorated. And the thought is that it was also possibly introduced through Chinese workers in the vicinity of northern Italy places. From there, the virus traveled to Austria. Again, as it seems to be the case that the virus is transmitted through individuals. In this case, a young couple from Italy traveled to Innsbruck in Tyrol, and from there it came to Ischgl, the infamous Ischgl, and from there it sort of hit the world. And there are now genetic studies really nicely outlining the path that the virus has taken across the globe. There was also a famous Biogen, now famous annual leadership meeting in Boston, which was sort of the main source for outbreaks in the United States with all the terrible consequences we know. WHO declared the novel COVID-19 disease outbreak on March 11th, 2020, a global pandemic. And early estimates, and now I want to get into some of the pure methodological issues for the R0, and I'll explain in a moment what this is, was that it was ranging somewhere between 1.5 and 3.5. There's a colleague of mine from Harvard who initially raised a lot of attention by basically shouting out, wow, this is a really high R0. And it turned out to be the case that in some ways he was right with his worry very early on, because it has indeed had some major consequences in the United States. In Austria, just briefly, because you will hear much more about this later, the first wave showed a peak around March 26th, and a lockdown was implemented on March 16th in Austria. So when Austria experienced the peak, or around that time, the term came that we need to bend the curve, we need to flatten the curve. And what does this mean? Essentially, in my view, this paper by Thomas Pueyo really nicely explains the concept of what tends to be necessary in outbreak situations. The hammer and the dance. We lived through a situation where mitigation was necessary in March because the previously implemented containment was no longer helpful. And that's what Pueyo referred to as the hammer. After Austria had brought down the number of new cases to a manageable level, the dance started, which is what we experienced through the summer. So let's come back to, in my view, a few perhaps guiding principles if one wants to think about the severity of an outbreak. And to understand the uncertainty surrounding, because we all see now every day how uncertain still we are about so many aspects of this outbreak. There are 4 that I want to mention today. The R0, the case fatality rate, the incubation period, and the immune status in a given population. So this R0, the basic reproduction number, should not be confused with the doubling rate. It's basically a way to describe the speed at which a disease spread, or if you will, the contagiousness. It's a very simple concept. An R0 of 1 on average means 1 person infects 1 other. If there's an R0 of 2, 2 people will be infected by 1, etc. So intuitively, an R0 greater than 1 has the potential to lead to an outbreak because the number of cases are prone to increase. Like I already said, now we can put this into context, the R0 of COVID-19, which falls between 1.5 and 3.5. So this definitely has the potential to lead to an outbreak. And I wanted to contrast it, for instance, with the R0 of measles, which is around 12 or higher, or the R0 of the flu, which is somewhere around 1.2, 2.2 if no measures are in place. And Ebola has an R0 of 2, just to give you context here. Lastly, the goal always is to bring the R0 below 1, because then fewer and fewer people will be infected. So let's now take a look at the case fatality, which is a concept that has to be seen in the context of R0. The case fatality varies depending on the disease we're looking at. For instance, for measles, which is very contagious, it has a fairly low mortality of 0.2%. By contrast, Ebola, which has, in comparison to measles, a much lower R0, has a much higher mortality rate. So these two have to be looked at together to really assess the severity of an outbreak. For COVID-19, early projections from China indicated some variation in the case fatality rate, but lying somewhere around 2.3. And there are recent papers, I have put up one here that just came out a few days ago, basically corroborating a case fatality rate somewhere in that range, but heavily depending on the age of the person being affected by COVID-19. Third, I want to talk about the incubation period. For COVID-19, it lies somewhere around 5.1. It can span up to 15 days. And the infectivity, and this is the important point, starts before persons develop their first symptoms. So there's uncertainty in the time period from when a person will be able to infect somebody else. And lastly, the immunity. SARS-CoV-2 was a completely new virus, which we haven't had on this globe before, at least not we humans. Meaning that there is nobody who has been immune against the virus, and we also don't have a vaccine, which means that now we also know that the prospect of reaching herd immunity is dim, that unless there's a vaccine somewhere close by, this implicates COVID-19 still as a very serious global threat. So talking about the mitigating factors, we want to either see vaccines, like I just mentioned, in order to slow the spread of transmission, or we want to know what the level of immunity is and up that level of immunity in a given population in order to slow the spread of a disease. This brings us then to the effective reproductive number. The effective are not, in contrast to the R naught, factors in now this amount of people who are immune in a given population. It's a simple formula where you basically multiply R naught with the proportion of the host population that is susceptible. And to give you an example what this means, we heard earlier that the R naught for measles is 12. If, let's say, half of the population were immune because they are vaccinated, it would mean that 12 times 0.5 is 6, that the effective R naught now is 6 rather than 12. So we can determine what is the level of herd immunity necessary in a given population in order to stop a viral outbreak. Now, what is herd immunity? We speak about this when there's a sufficiently large proportion in the population that is immune to COVID-19. And how do we estimate that proportion? Well, let's take a look. There's a simple formula again that you can apply, R naught minus 1 divided by R naught. And if you use this formula and calculate it for the range that we have seen with COVID-19's R naught, the basic R naught that lies somewhere between 1.5 and 3.5, applying that formula would mean that in the worst case, at least 71% of the population would have to be immune. In a better case of an R naught of 1.5, 33% still would have to be immune in order to stop the spread of the disease. So, coming back to the hammer, which we had applied over the summer and had worked, had really brought the numbers down. The dance had begun in Austria in particular, elsewhere too. We had seen quite remarkable successes, which led to removing some of the corona measures that had been put in place before. But almost basically on the same day that the corona measures were removed, a first cluster was again reported, coming out of Linz in that particular case. Which brings me to another phenomenon that is really important for especially COVID-19, in general for outbreaks, but as it seems especially for COVID-19. Super spreading events have really sort of defined the outbreak from the very beginning. If we remember back, Ischgl, for instance, the Diamond Princess cruise ship, Heinsfeld in Germany, where a carnival took place, several super spreading events within nursing and elderly homes with often devastating outcomes, choir practices, nightclubs, meatpacking industry over the summer, and tourism. Many of the events that we have been heard of and read about lately took place in the context of such super spreading events. So let's look at the super spreader. It is definitely an important phenomenon also for the derivation of R naught. Just briefly, we don't know much about these events yet, but apparently there are various factors that can determine or have been suggested to define a super spreader based on host factors, but also pathogen factors and environmental factors. Now, to consider this super spreading phenomenon, two more terms I want to introduce: the secondary attack rate and the dispersion parameter K. The secondary attack rate is a simple concept which basically tells you if in a closed environment one person is infected, how many of the other people in that environment will become infected. And for COVID-19, again, early estimates from China place that value somewhere between 30, 40, 20%. Could be slightly lower, could be slightly higher, but it is a sizable number in any event. And this here is based just on one example of a study that was published from China. And it brings us to the fact that because of this secondary attack rate, R naught can be quite misleading because it's an averaged number. And just consider this. You have a group of 10 people where each of the 10 persons infects one other person. This will give you an R naught of 1. If at the same time of these 10 people, only one infects 10 other and the 9 other people don't infect anyone, it still gives you an R naught of 1. So it shows that the R naught cannot take into account the spread that underlies the fact that some people infect more than others. And to take this variance into account, I get to the second parameter, the dispersion parameter K, which is also often a key parameter in general in studying outbreak dynamics. Basically, K is something that helps us differentiate in diseases whether or not they are likely to be very uniform, so people tend to infect similar amounts of others, or if there is a large difference. A K number above 1 tends to indicate little variation in spreading patterns, meaning that persons typically infect equally many others. But a K number below 1 indicates high variation, which means that certain people infect a considerably higher number of persons than others too. So a low K value implies that more transmission will come from a small number of infectious people. What about COVID-19? Early estimates again suggested that the dispersion parameter of COVID-19 is somewhere between 0.1 and 0.5, which is a low, relatively low K. And it would mean that about 10 to 20% of COVID-19 infected persons infect 80% of those that have been infected thus far. And this also has been confirmed by a fairly recent study, came out just a few days ago from India, a large study with over 1 million persons who got infected and their contacts traced. And that study also shows that only 5% of the persons studied were responsible for infecting 90% of those who got the disease. So a low K brings both good news and bad news, and I'm getting close to the end here. On the one hand, and that's the good news, super spreaders could be easily tracked, and it may help to confine local outbreaks. If you find a super spreader in their contacts, you can isolate them and prevent further outbreak. The bad news, however, is, and in some ways perhaps what we are experiencing right now, is that even if a pandemic has been largely contained, infection rates can quickly rise again and uncertainty persists. So where does this leave us? We're waiting for a vaccine, and once we have one, will people accept a COVID-19 vaccine? But looking forward, in the view of many of my colleagues, one thing becomes clear, because this is a zoonosis and zoonoses are prone to become more frequent in the future. One way to move forward will be to strengthen our One Health approach, which takes into account that the health of humans, animals, and the environment are interconnected, and that we have to begin to formalize One Health strategies in moving forward. And with this, I want to thank you and hand over to the next speaker.
Dear Dr. Schernhammer, we thank you very much for this fascinating talk and the compact overview on this matter. Maybe we can share some questions afterwards with Dr. Schernhammer and have the discussion with her. We're very much looking forward. And in this case, I would like to point out one survey from the EURORDIS, the European Organization of Rare Diseases. EURORDIS made an online quantitative survey, and they had a respondents rate of 8,500 people. And of these 8,500 people regarding rare disease patients and also rare disease families, and here I want to bring in the rare disease context, around 7 in 10 patients got their appointments with general practitioners and also specialists cancelled. Moreover, more than 8 in 10 people got their rehabilitation therapies postponed or cancelled. And we would like to ask you here, from an epidemiological point of view, if the halted diagnostics and also the cancelled appointments with general practitioners and specialists, if this might have a negative long-term effect on these rare disease patients, and how, from an epidemiological side, how can one measure this effect?
This is a very important question, and you're absolutely right. in my previous life I was an oncologist, and I know also for cancer patients this is a critical question and was a critical question. I do believe that this is also an area where we must have learned from what happened during the first wave, as we are potentially heading in, again, more uncertain territory. During the first wave, there were indeed, like you point out, many diagnostic and therapeutic, maybe more to some extent unnecessary ones, but still a lot of appointments with doctors postponed. And I believe that this can be detrimental for the health of many of these persons who suffer from severe diseases. So I think it's really important to make a point that the hospitals are safe now. The doctors have learned how to deal with this pandemic, and the patients don't have to be afraid on the one hand side. And I know from my colleagues that they are open and offering now treatments as before the pandemic. And I really want to encourage everybody to take advantage of this now and to feel safe, at least as far as hospitals and practices are concerned.
Exactly. Maybe I may also ask one other short question. You just mentioned a fear of patients, and we're focusing on rare disease patients mostly. There is some kind of anxiety and fear that the pandemic can influence their health negatively, not just by being infected, but also maybe due to secondary effects of the pandemic, as you just mentioned. Do you, from an epidemiological point of view, maybe have an idea how one could reach those families, somehow provide more clear information, maybe guidelines, and possibly also accompany them in a way psychologically so that this fear and anxiety could maybe be lifted a little bit?
I think a lot of responsibility lies in the treating physicians' hands, that they can reach out to their patients whom they know best. But I also believe what you are doing here is really important, to organize an event where you raise awareness, and it will also transmit to the patients that they can see everybody is concerned about their health and does want to make sure that they feel safe. And for sure there will be patients who, because of their underlying disease, fall into a risk group regarding COVID-19, and this is something that the physicians are very well aware of and very able to deal with. So there should not be any reason at this point to stay away from treatments, and hopefully the doctors personally can convince their patients that that is the case.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schernhammer, for this great short discussion now. And I'm very happy now also to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Niki Popper. Dr. Popper studied mathematics, philosophy, and jazz theory in Vienna, in Barcelona, Moscow, Idaho, and received his PhD at the Technical University of Vienna. He's coordinator of the COCOS, the Center for Computational Complex Systems at the TU Vienna, and he's co-founder of 2 successful companies, including the DWH, the DWH-Drahtwarnhandlung GmbH, for simulation services and technical solutions in Vienna. Upon his main research interests are the theory and applications of modeling and simulation of dynamic and complex systems. And I'm pretty sure that you will recognize Dr. Popper and his famous graphs from the newspapers, from several TV interviews, as a leading simulations expert, advising also right now the Austrian government. And we thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for having me here. I want to make the connects to rare disease. When we started with DexHelp, the COMMIT project with a lot of partners, one project was the analysis, how is the treatment of rare disease in Austria? Where are the weak points? Where are the resources going? How can we fasten the process for new treatments, for example, with the partners of the health system, the Dachverband and Gesundheit Österreich. And when we started doing our simulations more than 10 years ago, we also thought, how can we focus in the simulation on the diversity of the people in Austria or in other countries, and on the diversity of the illnesses and of the treatments. It's a very complex and very versatile system. And so we said, okay, we want to use agents in microsimulation. I want to point out a few aspects today why This is also useful for the COVID-19 crisis and why we started using it. This, I will promise I will not bother you with too much mathematics, so I tried to only make the layouts. So we have a city of Vienna. You know this map from the last days, mainly from the elections, but today we see it in the aspect of COVID. And if we get one infected person in an area in the city of Vienna, we try to model and try to think what happens if these persons get contacts, and contacts in diverse places, in the working place, in the leisure time, and we already heard there is a lot of knowledge actually accumulated on how is this process. We heard about super spreaders, we heard about reproductivity and a lot more. So the question is, can we model this? Can we put this in a computer? And we started about 10 or 12 years ago to build a population of Austria, or population model, which is especially used for Austria, but was also used already in EU projects. And where we said, okay, how can we use agent-based models for the intervention analysis, especially for epidemics? So we had some publication in the last years that this would be a good approach. So we continued to work on this. And what is the basis? What are the informations? I'm not so much focusing now on the clinical studies and on the papers of the description of the illness, but on the actual data in Austria. So one thing is, if we remove this map of Vienna, we see a nice bluish picture. So this is the mobility of people in Austria. We analyzed them together with Ellen Hambury at the Technical University and Complexity Science Hub and other companies and partners in the WWTF-funded project. And we say, okay, we have to have a look how is mobility working. Why? Because it's different. This is the mobility in the shutdown. This was mobility before shutdown. If we take a closer look, it's not so nice, but more informative. That's Austria. So left bottom side shutdown, right side here. Again, pretty much mobility. But still, it's again 20% less than here. You might not see in this visualization, but depending on the measures we put on it, we can see, okay, with just a little bit reduction. So question one is, can we use this? And question two is, which models do we need to use this information? Second part is, we've heard a lot of the things, how are illnesses progressing? It depends on, for example, the vulnerability of a person. It depends on the age of a person. So we have the possibility to model for our agents, the 9 million agents in Austria, different processes of the illness depending on features of the person. So it's another need and demand feature for this. And it has to be flexible. When we started, we didn't know what data will we get. We were pretty fast, together with the colleagues from Medical University, we get access to the EMS. It's now very famous because it's in the dashboard. We all know from the media. And we've got a connects to this epidemiological media system. And of course, to additional data. It's the Sentinella project at the Medical University, the DINO network, which is very important, where we get data from symptomatic patients at the physicians all over around the country, where we get to know, have the influenza, is COVID-19, what else? We have, of course, the AGIS cluster analysis and a lot more. So models have to be flexible to use as much information and as much data as possible. What is the approach? Approach is to use a concept with modules. So good thing is we already had the population model and we had the contact model. Why? Because they are pretty the same like with other illnesses. Of course, it's different to HIV, the contact model, but it's very similar to influenza. We didn't have idea on the disease model, of course, and the policy model. And to give you a very short overview, the population model is so-called GEPOC. It's a generic population concept. Why generic? It can be used for various applications. We need different concepts for diabetes because long-term impact 20, 30 years. It's a totally different question than an epidemic outbreak. So we need a lot of different approaches, also discrete event approaches, also system dynamics approaches. For this case, we took agents, so statistical representatives, which have at the start very little information, so age, sex, and so on. And then we can accumulate additional information, which is necessary for the research question. So in this case, it might be vulnerability, for example, other diseases, comorbidities, and so on. lifestyle might also be interesting. And so we can add some additional information to the model. Most important, of course, in this case for the spread of the disease is interaction of persons with the environment and with agents among themselves. So two things, the contact network we have to rebuild. Second thing, we have the pathways of patients if they get ill. And third thing, we have to model the tracing and testing strategy. Why? Because those are the only persons we see, of course, in the positive tested curves of the EMS. So normally we have frequently to adapt all these informations with also very basic data, with the data of the Statistic Austria for the development of the population, for the status of the population, but at the moment, of course, actually more important on the AMS and on the other data sets I mentioned. Very important aspect, to give only one glimpse of a feature, is the geographic toolbox. There we have to get a highly realistic population distribution. Why? Normally, if I show this map, it's enough to have a distribution on the Bezirke or the Gemeinde, and if you make at the end a statistical evaluation, it's enough to see it on Gemeindebasis. It's more exact than most information we get. But if we want to have contact processes or the interaction with the health system, we have to make it more detailed. So we have a mapping with the Human Settlement Project on the living places, on the working places. Where do people live and work? And so then you can see here the Tiroler Täler and the Alpen, where nobody is living. And so we can have a flexible tool to adapt on the question. So in our case, we adapted it with the contact module, where we have households, schools, workplaces, and leisure time. Why is it important? If we think on, okay, later on we try to implement the set of measurements, measures, we have to have, for example, schools to be able to close schools. So that's an important thing, and we developed it in advance. For the leisure time, we used the already mentioned mobility data. And of course, at the end, we have a contact module network where we have age-dependent, sex-dependent, household, school, so work-dependent aspects, where we try to calibrate our model on the past reality and map it to the future. Disease model, I don't want to go too much into detail. It is based on more or less a flowchart, where we have, for each agent, a own discrete event simulator, where we have steps with probabilities about the pathway through the age. Of course, it's age-dependent. Of course, it's dependent on the features of a person. Policy module is the most, in the media, the most, and for the decision makers, the most interesting. And I think that was the big challenges for some research groups. It's more or less the epidemic simulation is the basis, it's the fundament of the program, of the project. Even more important is, it is a modeling of interventions and the question of the outcome. And of course, there are a lot of activities at the medical university, for example, Tanja Stamm, which is a collaborator of us, or in international societies like the Society for Medical Decision Making, the International Society for Pharmacoeconomic Outcome Research, where we ask ourselves in the last decade, how can we use model in an evidence-based way to support decisions? So, to keep it easy, we can set policies, we can lift policies, and this policy timeline can be mapped on the system of the 8.9 million agents. So, to give you some aspects or some examples of results, when we have our virtual population, we can simulate the past. So this works until, for example, until August, and this is what we see in the media. That's what you see every time in the tip. You see the confirmed cases, you see the hospitalized cases, the ICU beds. And we can calibrate the simulation model on this data. So our model is doing the same what we see from the reality. And one feature is then we can think, okay, what, based on some hypotheses and some assumptions, we can say, okay, with a given amount of asymptomatic patients, in this case it was 50%, we can see how is the dynamic of the asymptomatic and the presymptomatic patients. And it's not so interesting the absolute number, but what we can see is when we thought we were at the peak in the spring, peak was already over. So you see if you compute the dynamic, you can see that the asymptomatic cases, the Dunkelziffer, rises because of the dynamic earlier than we see it in this data. So when we made the first studies on Antikörper, or on, no, not on Antikörper, but on actual cases here, we were not really surprised that it was a very low number. But it's not, maybe we have some more. We will see that, of course, with the Antikörper studies. Okay, that's not so nice for modelers, a lot of discrete events. We normally like continuous processes. I look at Peter Klimek, but life is not so nice for us. And so we have a lot of discrete events, and we have always to try, okay, what does this change? Because a model, we can fit the model very nicely when we have a very long continuous system. Then it becomes better and better, and we are sitting every week at the Prognosen-Consortium and think, oh God, they already changed something again, now we have to include it in the process, and so on. So, but that's life, and I think that's always the interesting thing. Our models and simulations are always only a tool for the experts from the other communities, from the virology, from the public health area. We heard, for example, impact on other areas, on the treatment of persons. Our model was used not only to close the hospitals, for example, in Vienna, but also very quickly to reopen it, because to start again treatments. And we were able to say, okay, we are safe more or less now at the beginning of April, and you can start again, use those hospital beds again for normal treatment. So I think it's very important. How much time do I have? Okay, I continue talking, you just will let me know. And I think very important is always the research question. So what do we need models for? So I think that's a very common mistake. You can use complex models, high-level models, not only for one research question, but you have always to be aware what are the consequences and the implications. So for example, at the beginning, at the mid of March, we made an analysis of the impact of leisure time context, just to get a feeling on, okay, what might happen if we reduce the leisure time context. And so you can see here, okay, we saw then, we will have an area where we get the situation working, and we have an area where we have no chance. And so we continued then working on this. And I think at the moment, one very important thing is, for example, the evaluation of tracing. Tracing is as far as we know now, it's a very effective policy, and we heard it from the speaker before, especially because we have super spreading, and especially because of these features of COVID-19. So tracing works pretty good, and but it only works until the situation becomes very bad, let's say. So it's more effective when you start in the beginning. And I think that was a very interesting discussion with a lot of colleagues from medicine, from other areas, where we tried to convince the decision makers to say, it's very important to do this. It is important. And they said a little bit in summer, yes, it's important when it comes back. And I think such models can help to say, no, you have to think 2 weeks, 4 weeks in advance. I mean, it's the same thing with prevention, I'm pretty sure. I'm not a physician, but I know this because the discussion with colleagues of us is you come with prevention, everybody says, politics normally says, yes, that's interesting, but you know, and in this case we have a real-time experiment where we have all 2 or 4 weeks, we try to tell, okay, we have to be careful, and we start to understand each other. And I totally understand also decision makers, because it's totally unpopular to make measures in a phase where everybody says, okay, we are safe now. So it's very important. That's a picture of a preprint where we can see, okay, it works not only that we have a better reduction, but very important is this downgoing area here, which is the maximum number of quarantined patients. And it shows us the more effective this measure is, also the less persons have to go in quarantine. And this will be a big issue in November, because we have now an increasing number also of other diseases. And it will be a big thing if, I don't know, half of the school kids in Vienna are in quarantine in November. We won't be very happy, especially those who have kids. Okay, some other examples. Evaluation of age distribution. This is a not so actual one, but what you can see is always a discussion, which persons do we see in the AMS data, in the dashboards. What you can see, it started here in Ischgl, which is a big issue at the moment. And we have patients, so that's always the amount of patients at a given point. And there we had 20-25%, so in the 20 to 40 aged persons. And then we see this increase here, elderly persons a month later. Why? Because we looked at the Pflegeheime. So we looked at the elderly person, which is from a strategy to cope with the disease, a good one. It was really a good concept to keep these vulnerable persons safe. But for the very unpolite mathematicians and computer scientists guys, we see only a not so good information because probably this is not true. Probably this is a higher amount why we had a better look at this area. Next steps, we see increase of the number of the young persons. And when we remember in the summer, we had a lot of 20 to 30%. At the end of August, we had 54% aged between 15 and 30. And then we can see with our model, okay, let's compute it and what will happen. And what happened in the model and what happens now also is we have this refleeting to the elder person. So we now have the first impacts at the Pflegeheime. We have now the adaptation to the normal Alterspyramide. And that is what you can see with such dynamic models in a very good and clear way. And so all this information contribute to have a clear picture of the dynamics of the system. Last point, when we imagine we have a virtual distribution, a virtual population with 9 million people, and the question is always, or pretty often not, what will be in 1 month? Why? Because it's very unsafe data. We have measures we don't know. If tomorrow Mr. Kurz is saying something new, we are not able to compute it. But what we can do is to make the analysis of the dynamics. In this picture, for example, we see the cluster distribution. So our virtual persons and the patients then have the distribution. And what we can see now is for all these clusters in Austria, given, for example, on a strategy for tracing and testing, we can say, okay, let's try to find out what other clusters looking like. And you can then make some interesting analysis. So for example, for a given strategy, you can say, okay, where are the most clusters? Are they going over the households or over the leisure time or over the care homes? And what we can see in our simulation is, of course, the potential whole truth. So we are God or we are the fate or whatever, because we see the whole system with the Dunkelziffer and so on. And what we then can do is to have a look, okay, based on the tracing strategy in the system, we can see what wouldn't we have seen in the real life. So this is what happened behind the scenes. And this is what, in the simulation, this health system would see. And of course, then we could do in the next steps, make the comparison of, is this probably looking the same like we see it? And can we change the system with measures to have another dynamic in this spread and testing and tracing strategy? So, thank you very much. It was a short glimpse what we are doing. I hope it was slightly interesting, and I'm happy to answer some questions.
Thank you very much for these fascinating insights and also for your transparency, how this data acquisition is going on, how these results are coming to us then in the end also. And you're providing also not all of us, but also the policymakers with graphs, with computed models, which are and which might be the basis for decision making.
Good thing is not only our models. Also the models from Medical University.
Okay. So my question, my hypothetical question maybe might be that what kind of additional data you would wish for, or which data would be useful for you to optimize your models? And have you had also hurdles or issues regarding protection of data privacy also in this case?
Of course, that's a good one. Yes, we have a lot of wishes, and we discuss it very often with colleagues here at Medical University. I think we have to separate. I mean, the AMS is quite a good system compared to international processes. Why? Because the positive tested persons are really all over Austria collected and given look regionally into a nationwide system. There we have, of course, problems because of time delay, because it's really a lot of work for physicians in all the areas now in Austria. I mean, you have to imagine they had not so much to do with this, and now they have to test every day thousands of people, collect hundreds of persons. So yes, there we are quite good, but we have problems in other areas. So one example is it would be a very important step to have a given national test strategy where we know for which purpose, which test was used. Then we could use this in a pretty statistical, more relevant way to have the ratio between positive tested and negative tested. To give you an example, we asked their colleagues in Lower Austria on the hospital system and said, okay, let us know you are testing as well. What are your results? And they had nothing. Why? Because they test their personnel, point one, hopefully they have nothing, and they test persons who come for the next leg operation, and they were very safe probably in the last days because they want to do the operation. So there we have nothing. Asymptomatic persons, schools, gastronomy, a lot of areas. And of course, symptomatic patients amount is much higher. So what would be very important is test strategy for Austria, documentation of tests, then we could use them in a much more efficient way. But I know before people hit me, it's very complicated. They have a lot to do in the moment. I think we need more resources, not only for operating the system, but also collecting data. Why? To get more evidence. So my colleague said yes, and you asked impact on other issues, on other diseases. For example, it was very important, WWF started grants for concurrent diseases, so what happens in the health system, in the social system, in migration, and so on. They started at the 3rd of April, and I think it's very important to collect data, also to make a posteriori analysis to see what went wrong and what went right.
Thank you very much for this answer. I would have another short question. Maybe it is a little bit naive, but I'm, for example, from a very different topic, so this is all very complex to understand sometimes when you're not from the field. I was just wondering if you could give a very short, maybe simple explanation. When a new situation like the corona pandemic starts, and in Austria we had the first cases in February, but of course before in other countries, but where do you start your model? So if you don't have cases in the country before, which data do you start with? And also another thing, when we want to bridge a bit to the rare diseases, do you think it would be possible to also make models for the future to predict how rare diseases could be, or the patient care could be modeled in the context of the pandemic?
In the context of the pandemic, okay.
Or the influence of the pandemic on rare diseases, and it's a very complex
question. Yeah, two good ones. Two good twice. No. So first one, that's a good question. As I mentioned, we developed this population model to reuse it in various areas. It was developed in a big COMET project, and it's now continued in a platform for research. We not only use it for health issues, but also for energy, mobility, logistics, and so on. And what we did in January, we said, okay, what can we do? And you're totally right, we had no idea. You know, there were the first informations from China, and we thought, but what we could do, when you remember these modules, we said, okay, we have the population, we have the contacts, we already know it, and we had, of course, projects on influenza, on measles, on polio, on dengue fever with colleagues from Harvard and the Philippines, and so we had a lot of experience. And then we started to compute a hypothetic disease. Yeah? We called it, you know, corona, hypothetic, whatever. And then we started to calibrate. So in the first steps, we just said, okay, what might this be? And if you heard the presentation before, you had a lot of information on how is the spread, super spreading, we only know in early summer. How is the illness, how is the prognosis for illness, how is latency, how is incubation time. And so the possibility, and I tried to point it out, is we can adapt this model. So every week we adapt this model. It's a very not so nice process from a scientific point of view, because you're always doing things and working on the machine. So it's very complicated for the publication work. to make it evidence-based and to make it very clear and transparent, but we can adapt it for the decision support. And so we iterated it. We started to include the Chinese studies, then we started to introduce the numbers from the US, from Italy, from France, from Germany. And so we increased the capabilities of the model with every week. So we were able already in March to compute the set measures. Why? This was pretty lucky also because we had the schools in the system, we had the working places in the schools, so it was pretty easy to, for example, take the measure of closing the schools because our agents have an age, so persons from 6 to 14 are staying at home, have more contacts at the home, and 14 to 18 the amount of persons at school. And so there are some things which are very complicated. We have very big limitations, to be honest, in the area of the probability of the transmission. So if you want to ask how good are masks working, we always have to calibrate the model and the output values. We are pretty good in the contact modeling, but for example, hygienic measures are very complicated to implement. This was the one. Rare diseases are always pretty complicated. We made a lot of analysis also with the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute, where we had some contact. It's very complicated. Why? Because the numbers are so low. So it's always the question for models in the rare disease area. We know it's a very high impact on the health system. It's very important because the development has to be improved. It has to be fastened that we get new treatments. But it's tricky, to be honest. But we try to work on it.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. We are very much looking forward also to discuss with you later at the end again with all the speakers. And if you at home or where you're watching our live stream would like to ask a question, please just write us right now, considering different talks, considering this topic, and write us an email to ysa@meduniwien.ac.at. And now I would like to really cordially welcome our next speaker, Dr. Vanja Nagy. Dr. Vanja Nagy did her PhD at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York, and she was subsequently a postdoctoral fellow at the Mediterranean Institute for Life Sciences in Split, Croatia, and also at the IMBA, the Institute of Molecular Biotechnology in Vienna. She is a key researcher at the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute for Rare and Undiagnosed Diseases at the Medical University of Vienna and adjunct PI at the Center for Molecular Medicine in Vienna. Dr. Nagy's field of working is the molecular neurobiology, with a special focus on finding causative genes in rare neurodevelopmental disorders. And we are now very much looking forward to hear your talk.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction, and I commend you for the beautiful pronunciation of my name. My grandfather would be very proud. I'm very happy and honored to have been invited here by the two of you and by all the organization of the Young Student Association to be able to talk about a topic that's very near my heart. Before I start, though, I want to introduce the colleagues that I work with and our institute, because we are a specialized institute for rare and undiagnosed diseases. We are funded by the Ludwig Boltzmann Society. We are partnered up by the SEM Research Center for Molecular Medicine of the Austrian Academy of Sciences, by the Medical University of Vienna, and also St. Anna's Children's Hospital. And here at the bottom, you can see all my lovely colleagues. So we're quite a large group. And we focus on very diverse sets of issues, primarily basic research of rare disorders, as well as bioethical and societal implications of rare disease research and rare disease community here in Vienna. It's been mentioned so far by my colleagues already, and I just wanted to also restate a few facts about rare diseases because I'll be mentioning them throughout my talk. For those of you that are not familiar with rare diseases, in the European Union, a disease is defined rare if it affects less than 1 person in 2,000. And there are over 7,000 different rare diseases that have been identified so far worldwide. And while each independent rare disease is quite rare by definition, it affects maybe sometimes small cohorts of 20 people that we know of. Altogether, they affect about 300 million people worldwide. So just let that number sort of sink in for a minute. This is a huge population of the world that's affected. This is 30 million people in the US, 68% of the European Union population. And what makes these statistics even more staggering is that half of the patients that have a rare disease are children, making them an incredibly vulnerable group of patients. 80% of rare diseases are of genetic origin. And surprisingly, if you think about the 300 million people that are affected, the 7,000 different rare diseases that are out there, there's only about 400 different therapies. So the gap of identifying a rare disease and defining one as such and a possible therapy for this disease is huge. And this is one of the main problems and main challenges of the rare disease community that we should stress here. So what are the goals for rare disease patients and their families and researchers and health caregivers, of course, are two main goals. One is a genetic diagnosis, which surprisingly, as I will stress in my next slide, takes a long time to achieve. And the other is the appropriate therapy, which I just mentioned, there's really not much around. So before we start talking about specifically how the pandemic has affected the rare disease community here in Austria and around the world, we have to fully understand what the rare disease community has to go through every day when the economy is doing well, when the political system is doing well, when the healthcare system is healthy. This is what rare disease patients have to go through every day. And I drew up this little schematic to show you what are some of the obstacles for families and patients of rare disease patients have to go through. So the first step in their odyssey is to find the appropriate clinical specialist. This is actually a very complicated affair for rare disease patients because of lack of information and awareness about rare diseases, lack of training for clinicians, shortage of geneticists, local geneticists one can visit, limited access to diagnostic tools. There's no standard criteria for diagnosis. So the very first step at the very beginning, from first sort of symptom that shows up in a patient, they already have a huge hurdle to try to understand what is actually causing their symptoms. If they're lucky enough to have access to great clinical care, they then go on and need to find a genetic diagnosis. As I mentioned, 80% of rare diseases are genetic. So one needs access to next-generation sequencing, and we are using next-generation sequencing methodologies more and more, but they're simply not available everywhere, even in the most developed countries. And if you have access, it still doesn't mean you get a diagnosis. Whole exome sequencing leads to only 20 to 40% of diagnostic rates, which is not very high. 50% of rare disease patients actually never indeed get a genetic diagnosis. 40% of them receive an incorrect diagnosis at some point in their odyssey. And a third of these actually receive inappropriate care or unnecessary surgeries. So this is actually quite traumatic. Following, let's say, whole exome sequencing or next generation sequencing methodologies, one could come up with different, and I will talk more specifically later about, one can come up with different outcomes. One needs to then have functional studies in order to determine whether the genetic diagnosis is correct. And functional validation that is required for different disorders is not available at most medical diagnostic institutes. Finally, if you overcome all of these hurdles, you get to the point where you could think about having a therapy because now you know what is actually causing your disorder. And this is where the problem is that I alluded to earlier. There's very little financial incentive for rare disease drug development in big pharma. it is very difficult to justify spending a lot of money to get drugs to market that will only help a small cohort of patients, for example. There is a difficulty in setting up clinical trials when you have small cohorts that are not living in the same community and they're spread all over the world. And for this reason, there's only about 400 therapeutics available at the moment. So there's different incentives that are set up by governments to try to overcome this hurdle, but we are where we are. So this is best case scenario. The average diagnostic odyssey to get from the first symptom to a therapy is about 5 years. But as I mentioned, half of rare disease patients never get a diagnosis, and many of them wait 15, 20 years to actually overcome the very first hurdle. So the question now becomes, where does basic research fit into this odyssey? You know, why am I here? Why was I invited here? And what can we do to help this vulnerable population? So next generation sequencing technology is available to basic research labs, such as mine. So we can actually collaborate with clinicians around the world that don't have access to these technologies and provide it for them. Small research labs are very versatile, and they have novel technologies available to them for different functional studies that are required for different small cohorts of patients. The discovery of therapeutic targets and therapeutic interventions is possible in a basic research lab. So we can do all the hard work and the busy work before a therapy can be developed. We can model the diseases in cells or model organisms or human-derived tissue. And we can also perform a small-scale preclinical phenotyping. So at these last 3 hurdles that I pointed out here, at these last 3 stages, we can actually try to reduce the diagnostic odyssey for any one given disease. So this is research pipeline of my group, and it's not an unusual pipeline for groups that do the kinds of studies that we do. So here at the top, we have a clinician with a rare disease patient with a detailed clinical workup. They contact us, and with our help, because I'm a neurobiologist, I'm at the neurology department at the Medical University of Vienna, and we work on neurodevelopmental disorders. We collaborate with clinicians at the neurology department to help us prioritize which case we should take for next generation sequencing. Following standard pathogenicity assessments, and every lab has a different one, we have one at LBI, we can come up with 3 different outcomes. One is a diagnosis, therefore we find a variant or a mutation that's already been discovered before and associated with this disease. We get back to the clinicians, we have them confirm this diagnostics, we have them confirm this finding in a diagnostic clinic, and the patients have their diagnosis. More often than not, we get a novel variant or a novel mutation in a gene that's already been associated with this particular set of symptoms. And we then have to do simple functional analyses to validate our findings. Or we find a completely new mutation in a completely new gene that was never before associated with this disease process. And then it takes pretty much several years, if not longer, to actually validate our findings. The outcome, the best case outcome, is that we have genetic discovery and we find common pathological mechanisms that would lead us to actionable targets for therapies. So what are the requirements for us to be able to do our work? This is pretty much what the requirements are for any basic research lab, but I want to kind of keep it specific to a lab that works for rare disorders. Obviously, funding is at the top of the list. We can't do this job without grants. We need to have close contacts with clinicians and patients. It's incredibly important that we can get back to the clinicians in order to be able to ask for more biomaterials or to discuss different hypotheses that we develop during our studies. We need reliable delivery services for human tissue and consumables. It's incredibly important that planes are in the air and boats are doing what they're supposed to be doing in order for us to be able to get our consumables. We need the access to the lab. Obviously, I'm saying this because we didn't have it for the first time this spring. We need to have access to our model organisms, and we need to have close contact with active collaborators. I mention active collaborators, and by that I mean if there is a lockdown or a quarantine in Texas and they're not handling their pandemic situation well enough, we cannot get data from our collaborators. So even though we're here in Austria and things are great here, our work is so international that if our colleagues are not allowed to get to their labs because of lockdown, the entire sort of system pretty much comes to a screeching halt. So what are the negative impacts of COVID on any one of these steps that are required for us to do our jobs? Pretty much all of these have been affected. Now, I have funding sort of in a different color because we have not fully absorbed the economic impact of what's to come. Our funding has been set before the quarantine, before this major economic and healthcare crisis. I presume the worst is yet to come for the work that we are doing, because we're going to have to brace for the fact that there's going to be massive restructuring of the funding organizations and what is actually being funded when it comes to basic research. So this is only to come. I'm going to mention a few facts because I only wanted to talk about the impact on rare disease research. I'm not a healthcare provider, so I cannot talk from personal experience about the impact of the rare disease community, but it needs to be mentioned since we're all here for this very reason. At the start of the pandemic, during quarantine, healthcare practitioners, research organizations, biotechnology companies, everyone had to shift gears to focus on the crisis at hand, which means that rare disease patients, as was mentioned before, didn't have access to any of this. Now, it's already difficult enough when things are great, but when you cannot contact your clinician because he is a first responder, when you cannot contact a physical therapist, for example, because they're also off being a first responder, there's a huge problem for the well-being of the rare disease community. Many of the organizations have halted enrollment in rare disease clinical trials and research in general. There's been a complete reduction in difficulty in enrolling patients in these clinical trials, which is really the hardest part, I think, and the hardest to stomach in this whole affair, because this is, the last step towards a better life for rare disease patients. And to be told, just as you get to the point of being enrolled in a clinical trial, that you have to wait longer is really tragic. So the survey that was mentioned earlier, and this is only a preliminary survey at the moment, pretty much states that 95% of rare disease patients have experienced really a negative impact of COVID. What I think we should also emphasize is that there is a positive effect on rare disease communities through the pandemic, which is the fact that now all of us that don't live with a chronic disorder actually know how it feels to not know what to expect, to not be able to go to your doctor, to not be able to leave your house when you want to, and to be scared for your health. This is what rare disease communities have to deal with on a daily basis, and now there's a global-wide understanding of what that actually means. And I really hope that we take this that we take this to heart when we get a vaccine, when we can go back to the new normal, that we don't remember those that are still dealing with their chronic illnesses. So I'm not going to repeat some of the results of this survey. So I was asked to talk a little bit about personal experiences, excuse me, when it comes to rare disease research, and I just want to mention a few. Obviously, the lab was closed down, and we had to figure out how to do wet bench work from home, which is very difficult. Coming back to work, we have to reduce our output expectations. Everything has slowed down. We have to constantly mitigate the possibilities of infections. We have to be very careful when we start long-term experiments to make sure that if any one of the team members is quarantined, that somebody else can take over. So these are the issues we haven't had to deal with before. So this is slowing down everything that we do. We had a specific patient where we contributed to the diagnosis. This little girl waited to be diagnosed for about 9 years. We figured out what the genetic cause for her specific disease was, and she was lucky enough to be invited to for a clinical trial that was ongoing. And just as she had passed all the hurdles, the quarantine and lockdown had started, and her trial had to be delayed. And if you can imagine and put yourself in the shoes of her parents who waited 9 years, having to experience their daughter's about 20 or more uncontrollable seizures every day, to be told that, yeah, maybe we have something that can help, but you're going to have to wait just a few more months or longer. We had a problem with contacting a clinician that had access to a patient. We had stumbled upon what we believe is a biomarker for a novel disorder. We were very excited. And in order to confirm our hypothesis, we have to get back to this patient, but the clinician is actually off being a first responder, and the patients are in quarantine, so we have to wait for this. Just 2 weeks ago, so after the lockdown had happened, precious tissue materials that we were able to get our hands on were destroyed during an unreliable delivery service because it got stuck at the border. So any time that there is a problem with crossing borders and things like this, there's been a lot of shutdowns, there's been a lot of waiting around on the borders. It's really the most vulnerable that suffer. And we had very important meetings canceled and rescheduled. For the rare disease community, having open communication is incredibly important, that the clinicians can compare their patients' clinical diagnoses or variants in their genes that may be causative. It's important that we get together very regularly. And we were just planning a meeting recently that was scheduled actually at the end of March with a small rare disease organization, and that had to be postponed and canceled. So what is the full scope of the problem? We have really no idea, to be perfectly honest. There's been a lot of online surveys, one that I just mentioned earlier, one that's being conducted by the NIH at the moment, one that's being conducted by the International Rare Disease Research Consortium, to try to contact the patients that are isolated, that are all over the world, to see what is the full scope of the impact on their lives, on their daily activities of this pandemic, one that is probably much bigger than for the rest of us. And I don't want to leave you on such a negative and alarmist note, so I just want to mention and talk about and maybe get everyone to think about is what can we do to sort of soften the blow of all of this? How do we brace for impact? And I think one of the most important things is to raise awareness. So I thank the students once again for giving me this opportunity, and I encourage you to continue on this path. We have to petition our government agencies against research budget cuts, most importantly, and also perhaps against, reshuffling research so much. I think a lot of the research is going to go into infectious disease biology, and that's great and important. I don't have anything against infectious disease researchers, but we have to ensure that there is enough budget for basic research for everyone. We have to work closely with local rare disease communities. So perhaps if a basic research lab has to restructure their focus, maybe the best idea to sort of mitigate some of the problems with deliveries is perhaps work closer with rare disease communities that are local as opposed to international, although that's, you know, sort of very difficult in our line of work. And most importantly, what I want to stress to my colleagues in basic research is to collaborate even more, to actively participate in various data sharing platforms, being open and transparent about our research so that we don't double up on research now that the financial problems are going to come, I think is more important than ever. And with this, I'm going to leave you. I'm going to thank this young group of people that are helping me do the work that I'm doing, and they're the reason why I'm here. I particularly want to thank patients and their families for their trust and for their participation in our work, our collaborators, and of course, our funding agencies. So I'll be happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Dear Dr. Noć, thank you so much for this extremely interesting, also very clear talk. I think you educated all of us a lot on rare diseases, and especially on the research on rare diseases and how difficult it is before and how much more difficult it is even now. Also, I want to thank you that you highlighted the patient's needs and really the focus on patients. In the end, this is what we all should be concerned about. Also, I was wondering, so I think from your last slides, I understood that also you think maybe that in the future, even more than before, we need to put more focus on the research on rare diseases, and even now with this complicating factor of the pandemic. I guess you would also say that this has to be more in the focus in the future. Can you imagine how we can foster this even more?
You know, people often ask me, okay, so you're putting a lot of effort, a lot of funding, and a lot of money on helping, you know, say 20 people that have a specific disease. And probably one of the, you know, always in my introductory paragraph to any funding agency is to say that focusing on rare diseases actually helps the entire community as a whole, because we begin to understand every genetic contribution to any given disease or any given physiology. For example, we study pain. So we study a group of people that don't feel any pain, and there's at the moment about 22 individuals that have a mutation in a particular gene that we're studying. And if we learn how we can harness this particular pathway, we can actually think about new therapies for chronic pain sufferers. So for individuals that are on the other end of the scale of pain perception. So studying rare diseases, if one has to justify such a small cohort, is actually quite easy, because you're looking at a genetic contribution to human physiology, which is of interest to all of us.
Thank you very much for this answer. It makes a lot of sense, actually. I have never looked on this from this point of view. Thank you very much. Maybe just a very short follow-up question. Thank you again for your talk. You mentioned the average diagnostic odyssey of 5 years. Would you think that in some time, retrospectively speaking, that it will be prolonged? And could you guess how much, or for how many years or days or months it might be prolonged actually?
Because of the pandemic.
Yes, because of the situation right now.
For sure, it's lengthened. For sure, there's a problem. A lot of, let's say, even private companies that are specializing in next-generation sequence technologies that are being used by various medical personnel for genetic diagnoses have reshifted their focus from sort of these type of sequencing to getting the COVID information for doing PCRs on different samples. So the chronic sufferers have been put to the wayside, so to say. So yeah, for sure, the diagnostic odyssey is definitely going to get prolonged. By how much, I don't know, but this is already happening, so we're already there, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, Dr. Notch. There's, I think, still a lot to ask. Maybe in the discussion we can go on. We're a little bit ahead of time, so I will go on and introduce our next speaker. Already our last speaker, in fact. He is Peter Klimek, and he is assistant professor at the section for Science of Complex Systems at the Medical University of Vienna, and he's a faculty member of the Complexity Science Hub Vienna. He received his PhD in theoretical physics in 2010, and since then gained experience as a research associate at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Luxembourg, and as project engineer at the European Virtual Institute for Integrated Risk Management in Stuttgart. Since 2017, he is assistant professor at the section for Science of Complex Systems, and his research focuses on how we can use big data and complexity science to improve just the future of medicine. So this is a huge task, of course. So he and his team is interested in modeling approaches and in predictions for complex socio-economic systems, which may help to, in fact, improve patient health and the healthcare system in the future. So I don't know about you, but I feel like I have used the word complex an awful lot of times during this short introduction. I think it is because his research is in fact very complex. So even more so, I'm now very much looking forward to his talk. Welcome, Peter Klimek.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for having me here. It's great to see that we have such a strong and engaged YSA here at MedUni, and these colloquiums are always a big event each year. And speaking of which, this year we are doing this in front of cameras. We are all wearing these kind of masks. This morning, when I brought my kids to kindergartens, they said, yeah, I can't bring this toy with me because it's hard to disinfect. So if you step back for a moment and look at what's happened, then obviously, I think it's worth asking the question, so what the fuck happened in the last couple of months? There are a lot of things that have happened. Niki Popper, Eva Schernhammer told you a lot of very important things. I try to add a little bit to this perspective from our research of what we think happened in the last couple of months, and how, based on the research that we did, we have a chance of explaining what happened in this curve and why it changed our lives so dramatically. So after basically doing a quick rerun of what we think happened in different phases of this curve, I want to conclude the presentation by briefly reflecting on what does this mean for rare diseases and what does this mean for where we are going. But first, let us look at this phase that we had here beginning or end of February, beginning of March, when you didn't hear so much about complex in the news, but a lot of the word exponential. So what happened then is, so we had an infectious disease outbreak. Infectious disease outbreaks are never the same. Some of them show a very sub-exponential behavior in the beginning. After a couple of days, around beginning of March, it was clear that COVID, particularly in Austria, showed a very much exponential growth. That you can explain such a thing in a mathematical model that was postulated about 100 years ago, and it's about if you write down the system of equations, it's 3 lines of deviation. So again, not very complex. But what I showed you, under which conditions there can be such a thing as exponential growth. And I think it was very important what Niki Popper said before. If this ingredient mix, we need to plan in anticipation of where we will be in 2 to 3 weeks. And this was a huge lesson that we had in the beginning of the outbreak, because we saw if this exponential growth continues, then after a couple of weeks, we might run out of intensive care beds, given all the knowledge that we had so far. And this, of course, got people to be exponentially scared. We published this back then. Then after 10 to 12 days, we were confident enough to say, okay, we have now leveled off enough that we are not anymore on this exponential trajectory that was around 20th, 21st, 22nd of March. Media was very much interested in our first statement that we might run into capacity problems when we said, okay, now we see we're leveling off, not so much interest, threatening mails from concerned citizens, how you can say that maybe we don't run into a complete catastrophe, but this is what life was back then. Why did this level off? Why didn't we see this exponential growth for a prolonged duration? A big role was played by so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions, which are the measures, which are the lockdowns and all the things that we read about in the news each day. And what happened is that you see here a timeline of this. I'm not going into this, but just to make sure that you understand that a lot of measures were implemented, not just the lockdown, but it was a whole bundle of things that were implemented in quick succession over February and March. And in the combined effect, all these interventions managed to bring down the growth by reducing this effective R of t, as you've heard before. This brought us to a little bit of a problem in the aftermath, because what happened is that countries implemented hundreds of measures simultaneously, and as they all came in many countries at the same time, it wasn't really clear in March what actually does work. So what we did, and what a couple of other groups did, is to just track in details all these governmental responses, to classify them, to build a hierarchy, and to look in as many countries as possible what happened there. And this is one of the data set that we then used in order to find out, now given this data set, can we tease out a little bit of what actually worked, and what was it that got us away from this exponential curve into the flattening that we saw later on. So this is what characterizes the second phase that you see highlighted here. So actually we've been leveling off before the peak, and then we've been going down and down due to the effect of these non-pharmaceutical interventions. But which one was it? What we did here is we considered 3 such databases of how to track non-pharmaceutical interventions. In total, there were about 50,000 measure implementations in more than 200 countries. To keep things simple, I will just show you results from one of these databases. And let me also make clear that here we're talking about the time span March-April. So from all the measures that governments implemented back at this time, what was it that worked? Was it the lockdown? Was it the wearing of masks? Was it that we had a very highly used healthcare hotline in Austria? What was it that worked? So, as I said before, this is not an easy problem to solve, simply because everything happened more or less simultaneously. So what we tried to accommodate for this problem is, on the one hand, use multiple data sets, on the other hand, use multiple methods, which I'm not going here into detail in explaining this, but basically we tried to shoot with everything at this thing, ranging from more or less traditional regression analysis to deep learning models. And the result is, so before I show you the results, so this is how I said before that countries basically implemented everything all at the same time, and here's a point or the visualization to drive this home. What you see here is each circle is, on a given hierarchical level, a measure. So here on this axis you see the time, and here we rescale the time scale for each of the countries that we look like, such that they are referring to the epidemic age, as we call it here, means the day since they passed a certain threshold of cases. And you see here early measures that were implemented, and here late measures. So the early measures include, for instance, that you start with information campaigns, that you issue travel warnings, border restrictions, then came the mass gatherings, school closures, gatherings of all places where people meet in smaller groups, until you have the final lockdown here. And in this phase, which was about 5 to 10 days after the countries reached 30 cases, you see that everything has been implemented at once, and this is the so-called hammer. Using these more or less sophisticated methods, we tried to prune out what of these measures really worked and make a consensus out of this. And this is what we briefly summarized show here. So what the result is that most effective are those measures where you basically close everything where people meet in smaller groups for extended periods of time. These are offices, these are schools, restaurants, bars, and so forth. These are also very effective movement restrictions. Of course, if there's a curfew and you're just sitting at home and don't meeting people, this helps to reduce the spread of an infectious disease, but also highly effective increases in healthcare capacity. So this has to do with PPE, that has also to do with the separation of infect and non-infect patients in healthcare settings. What was also effective, and maybe a bit more surprising, that these measures are almost as effective as this strict social distancing measures, are risk communication measures, and there we distinguish between two types of such measures. One is where you try to educate the public, and one is where you try to inform stakeholders and managers what can they do in their in their businesses or in their offices to make sure that less infections are happening. And so this is a strategy that instead of making mandatory rules, everyone has to wear a mask, very much relying on non-binding suggestions based on information. So if you wear a mask, you can reduce the spread of the virus by maybe 20%, so this is useful. What was also very important is governmental assistance in two ways. We need to protect people that are medically vulnerable, nursing homes, we know that, but we also need to protect people that are financially and economically vulnerable. So if you are in precarious working conditions, then you have to be able to afford not going to work. So this is not only a fiscal relief measure, but this is also a measure to combat the spread of an infectious disease. Things are complex, of course. There is no such a thing as the effectiveness of a measure. This always depends on timing and context. So I'm not going to the details here, but basically here we show that for different NPIs, for different measures, they can be completely different in terms of effectiveness, whether you look at what happened 10 days after they were implemented or 30 days after they have been implemented. Also context matters. So for instance, tracing and tracking is more effective in high GDP countries, which has low accountability in governance. On the other hand, we see that NPIs to increase healthcare capacity, that they are more effective in countries with a high control of corruption and regulatory quality and government effectiveness. So very much for these measures, what depends is when you do them and in which context you apply them and what other measures have already been implemented. So couple of questions that these results bring about that might be worth highlighting. So people often ask, how effective was the lockdown? Will we need a second lockdown? What we find is that overall lockdowns, they show a significant but rather moderate effectiveness. So there is a significant effect, but it's compared to other measures, it's not that high. To understand this finding, keep in mind that there is no such a thing as the lockdown. A lockdown is a bundle of NPIs that includes curfews, movement restrictions, comprehensive closure of public places. In almost all cases where countries took a lockdown, they had some of these measures already in place. And when then the lockdown happened, this added just a little bit of delta in the reduction of the reproduction number. And, but the important message is that if you make a suitable combination or a smaller package of less intrusive measures, then you can achieve almost the same effectiveness as by doing the whole bundle and doing the full lockdown. So this is, I think, an important takeaway here. We talk a lot about school closures. And to make sense of this finding, so basically if you look in the literature, you find papers in very good journals that say schools play no role at all, and then there is a JAMA paper that says 60% of the incidence is because of schools. So what is it? If you look a little bit closer into this issue, you then find that school is not school, and you have to distinguish between kindergarten and primary care and secondary care. If you separate school closures by which type of levels were affected, you clearly see that most effective are school closures that affect pupils aged 12 years to 18 years, and not so much if you look into kindergartens and primary schools. This is very much in line with what we see from other contact tracing data. So if you want to do school closures as a preventive measure, which should be one of the last resource, then please target the elderly age groups. Okay, so conclusions. No measure alone is enough to stop the virus, but you don't need all of the measures all of the time, and rather a clever mix that is tailored to a specific context. Okay, now let us move forward in time. So we had first the exponential growth, where that signaled an uncontrolled outbreak. Then we implemented these measures, and then we went down. This year, this phase here that started somewhere in mid of April to somewhere July maybe, I wouldn't call this a dance that we did there. If we look at this, you see that we had a very steady number of new cases per day over a prolonged duration, over several months. During these times, we had completely different measures in place. Here, at the end of April, we were still basically in a little bit of a lockdown mode. Here in summer, we already went on vacations and into bars again. So despite having different levels of measures in place, you see that we had more or less the same case numbers. This is something that is hard to understand. It becomes even more puzzling if you look in different countries and see that these linear curves, these constant new numbers per day, happened in a lot of countries, ranging from the US to the UK, Sweden, Finland, and so forth. So how can you explain this, that you see this behavior? Let me tell you from the standard theory that we have in how mathematical epidemiological models work. In order to get such a curve, what needs to happen is that the recovery rate, so how long you recover from an infection, and the rate with which you get infected, they have to exactly balance each other out. And the chance to have this over an extended period of time with completely different measures in completely different countries, this is basically zero that this happens. So what did there happen? And Niki Popper already told you, I think, what is the most essential part of the story, and that is that infectious disease spreads on networks. And these networks look very different for different types of network. So particularly I lifted this visualization here from a work of colleagues who looked into more details into how you can model such a network structure. But we have, I want to draw your attention on two different ways in which we can socially interact. One is the household layer, where we interact in a small group of people that is basically the people that we live together with at home. And the other, what is described here as community layer, that's a layer where we freely mix with each other. So this is if you go to a bar and celebrate there, if you have large parties and family celebrations, then this is a completely different network structure where people more freely mix with each other. And what our hypothesis was, that what explains the fact that we had this linear growth pattern is that within these different types of networks, the virus dynamics occurs differently. Namely, what happens, what happens, and what we could then show mathematically that happens is, if you compare the transmission rate of the virus with the effective reproduction number, then in the classic epidemiological models, you would expect that if your transmission rate increases, the effective reproduction number also increases, and if it passes the threshold of 1, then this is the point where exponential spread gets separated from suppression. However, if your spreading takes place only within households, you have a regime in between characterized by linear growth, so where the system has become more robust. So this, what was here one single point, has now become an entire broad range of virus dynamics that where the dynamics is contained in a cluster. So in this sense, the network acts as a regulator. If you sit in such a community then, or in such a densely connected cluster of nodes, then you go home, maybe infect your family, but your wife or your girlfriend has no one else to infect but you, so that the dynamic stops. So this is it in a nutshell, and which we could then show in this model here, and which in our view explains why we had over the summer this strange linear regime. Let me also conclude this by saying you can go from the linear regime again into a regime where you have a faster growth. And this brings me to the phase that we are currently in, where we went out from this linear regime in something where case numbers grew faster again. Well, we are still trying to figure out what happened, but coming from the measure effectiveness ranking that I showed you before, so these are the top ranking measures that we found are most effective in reducing the spread, and I just cross-thread out here those measures that we don't have in place anymore, and made it dotted or dashed if they are, if we're not 100% certain, or if we just do them partially now. And as you see, of course, the most effective ones are the most restrictive ones, and those we have basically got rid of. So in brief, what has happened now, we think, is that people came back from vacations. So we saw that we had a lot of infections brought into Austria for people that were going on vacation in infection hotspots like Croatia. This led to an increase in cases. It appears that this increase in cases partially overloaded our testing and tracing capacity, which, as you've heard before today, are key in controlling the epidemics. Having testing and tracing at the capacity threshold means that you need stronger NPIs in order to suppress the super spreading events. This hasn't happened everywhere in Austria, and this is why we are now having something that looks like a second wave. So how will this go on? I don't have a crystal ball. Epidemiological models are very bad in forecasting case numbers over the next month or even several weeks. But what I want to tell you is that we need to be more rational and more evidence-based in how we think about the current situation, how to go forward. We had some craziness last week in the news where at one point there were talks that we will soon have a second lockdown because we have, I don't know, 200 cases more per day in Austria. And on the other hand, we had pseudoscientists, Great Barrington Declaration, saying we can let this run uncontrolled. Neither of these two extremes are true. What we currently know of from the disease dynamics, we would currently reach the point where our ICUs are overloaded at case numbers somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 cases per day over 2 weeks. We are now around 900,000 cases per day, so we are still far away from that. But this can happen that you go from here, 1,000 cases per day, to 5,000 cases. If you put this in proportion to population, you see that Israel made such a move, you see that Madrid made such a move, the region of Aragon made such a move. This is possible, so we need to stay vigilant. There is no necessity to be alarmist about this and cry for a lockdown. Every day we have maybe 10 cases more, but we can't also let this run uncontrolled. Good. Now I'm coming to the conclusions and also try to reflect a bit what this means for other and rare diseases. So let's be clear, COVID-19, this was a disruptive structural transformation for the healthcare system, and I think the important game is now the long game, and we need to figure out how disruptive this was. A couple of transformations have been triggered that have long been overdue. So for instance, that we really think more strictly about a separation of infect and non-infect patients in healthcare settings. This has been long overdue. Also, a little bit of a speed up in digitalization, telemedicine, e-medication. This has long been overdue, and this can maybe also help us on the long run for the treatment of other diseases. One of the lessons learned that we had is, in order to better prepare our healthcare system for future crises, like the epidemics of chronic disorders to population aging, we need better data and better data access for research. And now I'm coming to my personal lessons. I'm coming out of this more skeptical than going into this crisis that this is something that we can achieve. So what we experienced at the height of the crisis, I'm talking here about beginning of March, is that no one cared and no one had the capacity to care about other diseases than COVID. So I met people that were also doing these models, not Niki, but other people that you also heard in the news, and they had models which assumed that the ICU beds are all empty, so there are no other patients than COVID patients. And this has persisted on many areas that people either didn't have the capacity to care about non-COVID patients or simply didn't want to do it. So our response to this perturbed focus was that we really wanted to get this running, that we monitor healthcare utilization across different medical fields in non-COVID settings. I think many of us will spend the next decades with understanding the ripple effects that this structural transformation now sends out in the healthcare system. So in the height of the crisis, we personally invested loads of our time in getting a monitoring system running, basically based on e-card contacts that we could trace where people are now going less to and which kind of patients are seeking less treatments and so forth. Ultimately, we had okays from all but one organizations, and then it fell apart because of a political conflict. And if you buy me some beers later on, I can tell you which organizations this were. But Anyhow, the sad but true conclusion from this is, sadly, due to the fragmentation of our healthcare system, this lack of transparency is by design. So with this, I'm already at the end of my talk, maybe one comment. So what did we do about this project? So basically the idea was we build a dashboard where we show the infection numbers respecting to how people utilize the healthcare system. As we didn't got the healthcare utilization, we just showed the infection numbers. At one point we painted the regions according to a color based on the infection numbers and called it Corona Ampel, and you know the rest of that story. With this, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Peter Klimek, thank you so much for your talk. I think I was right, your research is very complex indeed, but you gave us great insights into how you try to also get models running for a better healthcare in the future. Now these two last slides of yours, they are of course very interesting. I do not have the beers on me right now, but I would still be very interested, and I think all of us, in knowing, because this healthcare utilization changes across the medical fields. This is actually exactly what would be so interesting for us also in the field of rare diseases. What kind of lack of transparency was the problem that you are talking about? You say it's by design. What does that mean exactly, and how can that be changed possibly?
Yes, I think a big issue that we have is fragmentation. So meaning that we have responsibilities for different care sectors on different federal levels. This all amounts to this, that we have a comparably weak Ministry of Health. They really can't do much, even if they want to. And on top of this, we have a separation between those who supply the health services, those who require the health services, and those that pay for these health services. And if you look into this triangle, you see that there are a couple of perverse incentives where maybe it's not, particularly if you then see that some of them are separated into different regions, and where, for instance, you don't want to be able to see if, so if you would share this data and make it accessible for the others, they could evaluate what you're doing. And this kind of thinking, if I make transparent how people in my region utilize the healthcare system, I might expose weaknesses. That this is a showstopper for a lot of this research, and which might bring us into problems in the long run if we don't track that continuously. And
I understand that, of course, is a huge hurdle, and it's a huge pity actually also. Do you have any hopes that your project might anyhow be running in a different way? Because it would be exactly, I think,
no, I'm pretty sure that in 5 years, when this is not politically sensitive anymore to see what's happening now, there will be research data sets where we can do this. But what we really would need to know is right now, where do we have blind spots opening up in the population, where we have certain areas where the healthcare system is not doing its job properly. And it doesn't help us if we know this in 5 years.
Yes, exactly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much again for your talk and for your honest and great answers. And we still have many questions there. However, due to our schedule, and so that we can discuss all together with all our speakers now, in a few moments, we would like to ask you then, maybe again, hopefully, in this discussion round. And we would like to close this speakers session right now, and our discussion round will begin just in a few moments, and we will provide you with a slide for these moments where you can find some very useful links to different organizations. I hope that the live stream will show this slide in just a few moments. And what you can find there are links regarding the Pro Rare Austria, the Allianz für seltene Erkrankungen für Austria, regarding Austria, but also Eurordis, where you can click to the website of Eurordis, the European Organization of Rare Disorders, but also, for example, the European Reference Networks, the ERNs. And during this, we will accommodate our situation here, so we can have all our speakers with a safe distance, and we will just be back in a few moments. You will hear my voice telling you something about the ERNs in the back. And we will now, when we have this slide on, yes, thank you very much. We will now accommodate our discussion table. Thank you so much. we would now like to start our discussion round. Thanks for meeting us at our discussion table, all of you speakers. Thank you again for these great talks. And we are now happy to look forward to a lively discussion. And we encourage also, of course, all the speakers to interrupt us at any time so that a lively, spontaneous discussion might develop. So let's see. So we would start maybe with a general question, but also maybe pointing directly at you, Dr. Schernhammer. So in this time, many new methods evolved, also many positive methods. So considering also online consultation and telemedicine, including also online prescriptions and prescriptions per mail, this evolved very much. And would this be a good instrument to standardize also for the future? And in general speaking, maybe also for all the speakers then, to find new good methods, especially for rare diseases, but for all patients groups, would it be a good way to include, like it's happening right now, multidisciplinary approaches to reach the decisions, and also include, of course, representatives from vulnerable groups to find the best way for all of us?
In general, I do believe that we have had an unbelievable jump forward in terms of our knowledge of digitalization in every aspect of our lives, and in medicine also. There's several aspects. I think the short answer is it depends on when and where something will be useful to establish in the long term. I have spoken to colleagues who say that telemedicine works in some specialties really well and in others it doesn't work as well. But I do think, especially coming back to your the aspect of rare diseases, where oftentimes you need a real board of experts from a variety of backgrounds, and it's sometimes not so easy to get them together to sit on one table and discuss a case. I think this could be a useful way to facilitate the interaction between the various disciplines, especially in tricky cases like often is the case with rare diseases. So there I see great potential. In terms of therapy and the interaction with the physician, in my opinion, will always remain a personal one. So I cannot see that the interaction between the physician and patient will never ever be personal again. I think it's such a substantial part of the healing process that this, I think, won't change. But there will be lots of opportunities, and I just mentioned a few. There's also, of course, digital imaging. There's so many aspects where we really have seen a tremendous increase in the use of digital media, also in medicine.
Maybe is there an input also from our other speakers? Vanja and you have talked a lot about how necessary also it is to include really the patients, to think about the patients and their needs. Do you think there could be processes in the future to really improve their also the way of reaching healthcare by including them also in a process, or by including them in the establishment of new possibilities and methods to reach that better healthcare?
Absolutely. I think rare disease patients are really the experts in their own diseases, and it's time that we listen to what they're really trying to communicate to us. It's incredibly important to give them a voice and the ability to speak about their symptoms in the complex way in which they appear or arise, because they really are the experts. So it's incredibly important. I was a basic researcher, and I was very far away from translational medicine of any kind. So for me, this is very much a learning process as well. And the more I am in contact with the people whose samples we are actually studying in the lab, the easier my job is, because we can really kind of connect what I'm seeing in the dish with cells to what the patients are actually trying to communicate with me. Obviously, there's a clinician in there as well, because the basic research has to be translated to human physiology, which is something that's beyond my pay grade. But when it comes to the type of research that we're doing and where we're going and how we're focusing are assays that we decide should be performed on any given sample, I think the patients have a lot to say on that, for sure.
Absolutely. Yes, I have another question also to all of you, actually. Whoever would like to answer can answer first, but I would be interested in all your opinions, actually. We have seen since the pandemic a shift from, in research, in many research groups and many research areas, where people who were focusing on, let's say, HIV, are now focusing on COVID-19 or coronavirus research. Of course, for the basic science, to understand more about the virus, also for to find vaccines, of course. I would be very interested in your take on the positive and negative aspects of this huge shift and concentration of the research towards one topic. I don't know who would like to start first.
I think we will reshift.
Excuse me?
I think we will reshift soon.
We will, yes. Okay.
I mean, it's understandable and was, of course, also reasonable, especially as, for example, in Austria, we know laboratories started to help. In the actual situation, it was a good thing. But Peter and I discussed it already, and we said, Peter said, yeah, now it's time also to do something different again. And I think that's an important thing. Of course, it's a very important thing. And people asked me, were you able to have this model already? And I said, because last year we published on dengue and therefore we published on measles, so we are working on this in any case. And I think it's okay that now a lot of groups focus on it, but I think, and it will be a big issue, I think, for the decision makers, and you mentioned it for the funding agencies, to have a very good weighted strategy in the future. Yes, we have to be pretty much better prepared for impacts, but maybe the next impact is not a pandemic, you can name it. We can make a discussion, we will have 6 ideas. And I think we have to be prepared in our society to impacts, and we have to focus on resilience in our systems, not only in health, but in all areas. And it will be the work of decision makers and funding agencies to have a good and good weighted approach for basic research, applied research, and other areas.
So what happened in April and February is you could basically publish a New England or a Lancet by just being the first who has this kind of data where you show, okay, in 8% of COVID patients in this age group have hypertension. New England, okay. So this, of course, pulled a lot of people into that because you have very, very many low-hanging fruits. Meanwhile, I would say most of these low-hanging fruits are gone. If you want to go now into coronavirus research, at this point, then the whole world is already in front of you. Don't even go there. So I think for the research in terms of really understanding the disease, this is here the race is settled, and if you jump into it now, then you're too late. The other thing which I wanted to allude to, and which is I think more important, is if you compare to the financial crisis of 2008, there was a whole generation of economists and financial analysts who then took 10 years afterwards nothing else than to understand how this crisis and how Lehman, how this restructured the economic and financial system worldwide. And I think this is very much a topic that will stay with us, that we try to understand all the ripple effects that this COVID crisis sent out through our healthcare system.
If I may say, in my lab, I believe we will have permanent changes. It definitely has shifted because epidemiology is a broad field, and infectious disease epidemiology can be part of it. It hadn't been a major focus of our department before, but there is, because everyone is so affected, lots of interest, even by those who may not have been experts in the field before. And I can see a definite shift also among the young participants and also the faculty in the department who I believe will continue working in this area. And I will definitely support this because I do think it's nice to have, or good and important maybe even, to have an independent additional place where this type of research can take place, besides where I see mostly governments right now driving the research and also the policy decisions, and so this could be an independent voice in some form. I'm sure a plan will be developed how to establish this, but I think there will be permanent more focus on this area, definitely.
And multidisciplinarity is key, as so often, right?
Yeah, it has also changed our way to collaborate. We have multinational global collaborations already, which is mostly thinking forward in a way what's going to happen next once this pandemic subsides. And it's very interesting to get in touch with different disciplines and see the take on the situation. So it has been really an interesting time for us in science.
So that is a positive aspect, at least, in that sense, yes.
So Dr. Popper and Dr. Klimek, you both had in your talks that you really have always be up to date. You have to be fast, you have to produce models, and therefore you're also interacting with virologists, with epidemiologists, and there is also, of course, rapidly evolving know-how in different parts regarding this corona pandemic. So how fast can you really then implement these evolving know-how, this rapidly evolving know-how? How close are your collaborations, interactions there? And how and where do you find then these new facts, for example, in your prognostic model? Let's say there's a high-impact paper where it says that mostly asymptomatic patients are less infectious, let's say, just hypothetically. How would you then very fast implement this in future decision-making and in the models?
Okay, then I go first this time. So I think Niki outlined it during his talk, a bit of how, particularly in the beginning, it was looking at Chinese publications and looking at Italian and US publications and refining the things. So this was very much the same here. And at one point, I think it was maybe April, May, we had enough Austrian data, and honestly, the epidemiological situation hasn't changed that much since April when it comes to hospitalization rate, for instance. What we had are demographic shifts in the infected populations, but not really in the disease dynamics, not so much. Yes, so that's one thing. Concerning collaboration, yes, absolutely, multidisciplinarity is your key. So we have this forecast consortium where it's Gesundheit Österreich, Niki Popper and his teams, and a team from Medoni Complexity Science of Vienna. We're doing these models together, and with us sitting there are public health experts, and we have people, we're in regular contact with people from AGES who are tracking these clusters, and there it's very much about that we check our model assumption with their domain knowledge, and that we have a ping pong here to see, okay, where might we have something in our model that needs to accommodate it, or on the other way, do we see something in our model what might be helpful for them to understand why they see certain clusters and why not?
I think it's very interesting, Peter mentioned it. So we are meeting every week on Tuesday and discussing these things. So my work day is like I'm going to office, and then 3 persons are discussing with me why the numbers from the Innenministerium are different from the health ministry, and what the new study says from China and from India. And so it's an everyday work, and we try as good as possible to implement it, and we discuss it on Tuesday together, and what might this be, and what would this be. And then I mail with Elisabeth Buchhammer and with different persons. It's very complicated, and we have to divide. I mean, what we are doing at the moment is decision support. So we worked for a long time to be very efficient, fast with decision support, but the colleague already said, we have to look on scientific quality. We have to go back to what are needed publications. Like Peter said, in the first 2 months there was publications on everything very fast. I think we have to go back to be independent, to have a funding which is not in any way connected with decisions, but which is for fundamental research. And then we can move on. One thing might be interesting, what we use the models for is not only to give data into it, but to test hypotheses, for example, for data. So for example, in the future, for the immunity of a population, we can put a hypothesis in the model. We can compare what would happen in the outcome when we have this immunity, this immunity, this immunity, and then we discuss with the colleagues from virology, is this possible? What might happen if this is? So that's also an interesting approach for models in the future, I think.
Mm-hmm. So this is also then a way to validate also your models and processes. I mean, validation is always important, and you might see it then in 4 weeks if you have been right, for example, but are there also other validation processes?
That might be pretty interesting in the work. We always present the results of the work in the little on the method of the model, but in reality in my team, it's 1/3 is work on the model and 2/3 is work on calibration, parametrization and validation of the model. I mean, it's the same probably in your communities. Most of the work is done under the water line. So in our case, it's a lot of work for calibration and validation of these models.
Okay, we are, I think, already a little bit far in our time schedule, so I would like to ask all of you a question. Maybe we can go one by one, or whoever can contribute. I know it's a tough one, but I would like to try and see what your thoughts are. We would really be interested, also our viewers, to hear some words of everyone, maybe for your own kind of conclusion, with your own thoughts, also with the background of your own research on the topic rare diseases during COVID-19. So how rare diseases are affected, or how we could help with your different kind of research in the future to make the care of patients with rare diseases better, even though we have a pandemic going. I know it's a difficult one, but maybe with a look to the future, I would be very interested what your ideas could be.
I think if I may start. I think for us, the primary concern should be to try to shorten this diagnostic odyssey for rare disease patients. And this is one of the things we can actually do from home. So I've never had to think about, okay, how to divide up my wet bench studies with my dry bench studies. So since the pandemic, we can really reorganize the way the lab is run so that certain things that can be done from home or that can be done offline are done in a much faster way. And it also had made us much more collaborative, because there's things that we simply cannot do ourselves, and we have to share with other colleagues that are doing similar kind of research. So I think sort of projecting into the future and how it has affected us and how we can benefit the rare disease community, I think is that we simply have to be faster. We don't have the luxury of taking our time so much, and I think that's one of the big lessons that we can take from this.
Thank you very much. Yes?
Well, I think one good thing is that even though individuals with rare diseases often belong to the risk group for COVID-19, for instance, due to their immune systems that might be compromised or other factors that come with their diseases, they tend to not always or often at all be institutionalized, which would be another potentially problematic risk factor, as we see in the elderly homes and retirement homes. So it's education also for individuals who might be at higher risk, to know what their risks are and to be aware of the situation, and then also to have doctors who do not, stay away from providing diagnostics or treatments, but embrace the situation and know how to deal with it, and make sure that there's no interruption in the treatment of individuals with rare diseases.
Especially for this very vulnerable group, of course.
Yeah, I think the overarching aim that we have in this building, in the Medical University of Vienna, is to go towards precision medicine. And in this sense, precision medicine means that for each, even the case can be as complicated and as you want it to be, but in order to do precision medicine and tailor the treatments to the patients, we need to have a control group of patients that we can compare with our index case. And this is now where all these data issues come into play. This is even more important for rare diseases, because here our strongest limiting factor is simply the N. And everything where we go into the direction of building up an infrastructure that you can access nationwide registries for research purposes can tremendously help in identifying, okay, I have here this patient with these characteristics, and even if I don't know the rare disease diagnosis, but I can see if there were these symptoms and these treatments and this misdiagnosis, and I can match it up to different databases that I can, some indications of what might be behind this. Or this is feasible now, this is doable now, and we're not doing that because we don't have the data to do that.
So basically, do I understand it right? We need transparency and communication.
And we need to build, like the Scandinavian countries do it, we need to build up an infrastructure in Austria that we can answer such questions using data and making it transparent, and that every research institute gets access to this kind of data, and then we can really improve the treatment also of our patients with rare diseases.
Maybe some last comment from Dr. Popper on this side?
No, I think most of the things was it. I think we'll see a change in the research. We will see a change how, based on data, research can be done. I tried to point it out that in our models we try to build to model the diversity, and I think that's a big issue for rare diseases, but also for other questions. To be able to have models to give the research the possibility to make also work together with models where you can see the impact on treatments. And I think we will see the same what you started with. We will see the difference in the processes in the health system. And that's the same. I think we need a lot of areas where we need the personal treatment, but a lot of areas can be done. I think also the hospital of the future will be different. We have seen that it's not a good idea to have COVID-19 patients in an area where you have very vulnerable person in a hospital, and maybe they don't even need a very big treatment. I'm not a physician, but to say it very easy. I think we've learned a lot, and I think a lot of things will change permanently.
So we have learned a lot of things are changing, and a lot of things will have to improve. In the future, definitely, I think we are all more or less on the same page with this. But I see also, and I'm very glad to see that on one spot, that different fields are working towards this direction also. And I'm very happy that we had US experts talking about the pandemic, and also with one eye to the rare diseases. Thank you very much to our experts today.
Thank you very much. Patients' care and patients' interests shall always be in focus. Today, we wanted to highlight insights specifically from the scientific fields of epidemiology, basic research, and mathematical statistics. Therefore, we would like to ask everyone for their understanding regarding our program today. In future events, it would definitely be essential to include also personal insights or patients' representatives. We from the YSA would like to thank cordially all our speakers today, Dr. Schernhammer, Dr. Popper, Dr. Nagy, Dr. Klimek, for your really excellent talks, vivid discussions. Thank you so much, and thank you very much for making this afternoon possible. And we would also like to thank all our collaborators, our YSA associates. We would like to thank our sponsors. We would like to thank the Medical University of Vienna, and here, of course, especially the colleagues from the Corporate Communications Department.
And of course, we would also like to thank you, our virtual audience, for joining us today for our YSA Autumn Colloquium on rare diseases during COVID-19. This was actually the kickoff and the start to a new colloquium series that we are now starting, which we call our Road to YSA 21. So I always want to emphasize this. We're very happy if some of you might be maybe interested in joining us, in joining the YSA. So maybe you feel like you would also like to organize an event like this in the future. So we're always happy to hear from you. Just write us, and you can also find us on Facebook and even on Instagram.
And we would like to finish today's YSA colloquium with one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Judah Folkman.
As long as there is an unconquered disease, an injury that cannot be repaired, or a method of prevention that remains beyond reach, we have an obligation to conduct research. Research represents hope, and for many patients and families, hope is the best thing we have to offer. We pursue our investigations so that one day we can offer more than hope, we can offer health.
Thank you, goodbye, and see you soon.